The publication and subscribe pattern, or pub/sub pattern, is a really useful way to solve certain problems and make your code easier to work with. Let's start by talking about the problem. Let's say that object A wants to communicate something to object B. One way to do this is to have object A do so directly. This isn't necessarily bad. However, let's say now that A also needs to communicate the same thing to C and D. Now, this is where it starts to get messy. A suddenly has a bunch of code inside of it that is directly tied to these other objects. So every time you change one of these objects, you might need to go change code in A as well. Forget, and you have a game crashing error. Now, one solution is to reverse the direction that communication goes. Instead of A telling things to B, C, and D, these objects could look at A to get their information. Now A doesn't need to care about anything other than itself. This is a major improvement and often a good solution, but it will only work if the information these objects need will be there when they are running their code. For example, what if A is going to destroy itself after it runs its code, or it needs to report something that will be true only for the moment that A is running its code? The pub/sub pattern resolves this issue by allowing A to indirectly communicate with as many objects as necessary, whether that number is 0 or 100. And it works like this. When something happens that A wants to communicate to another object, A tells one and only one other object. I tend to call this object the pub/sub manager, but you can name it whatever you want. This is the publish part of the publish and subscribe pattern. Any object that wants to know if a certain event happens tells the pub/sub manager, I want to know if this type of event happens. And the pub/sub manager says, okay, and adds their name to a list of subscribers for that event. And then, if that event happens, the pub/sub manager goes through its list of subscribers and tells each subscriber that the event has happened. Those objects can then do what they want with that information. And there's no limit to the number of events or subscribers that you can have with this system. So that's the problem and the solution. Now let's talk about how to implement that solution in code. There are different ways to do so, and I'll try to point out some of the variations as we go, but the method I will use for this tutorial is to have the pub/sub manager track events and to have objects, or more accurately instances of objects, subscribe to those events. So any object can publish an event and any object can listen for an event to occur. And I am going to limit this to instances, but it could be expanded to work with structs as well. For this to work, we will need a set of scripts that allow objects to publish and subscribe and unsubscribe, and a pub/sub manager that can maintain a list of events, add subscribers to and remove subscribers from an event, receive publications of an event, and notify subscribers when their event has occurred. So let's switch over to GameMaker. I have the project running here. All of this art is from this itch.io asset, and there is a link below and in the project itself to this page. The hero can run around and pick up coins, open a chest, and once they open a chest, all other chests are destroyed. When you pick up coins, by the way, you see the coin number going up. The hero can also get killed and respawn, and you can restart the entire room with R. Now, normally I go over all of the code in the project, but I got a little bit carried away and I don't want to lose focus on the pub/sub system, so I'm only going to be looking at code that interacts with the pub/sub system. However, the project itself is available for free on GitHub, and you can look through all of the code there or download it and look through the code in GameMaker if you're interested in how all of this works together. So let's look at the pub/sub code. And for that, I'm going to break it down into two parts. First, I'm going to cover how to use the system. Second, I'm going to cover the system itself, how the system works. I'm doing this because I think that you can use the system without understanding it, and understanding it and how it works is definitely more complicated than just using it. You can use the system in just a couple steps. First, you need the pub/sub manager and this script file. Then you need one and only one pub/sub manager to exist in the room. There are ways to use multiple pub/sub managers, but as I have it set up, you only need one and can only have one. I tend to make my pub/sub manager persistent and create it at the start of the game, but that isn't technically necessary, and for this project, it just exists in this room. Next, any instance can publish an event with the function pub/sub publish. You can see an example here, which I'll cover in more detail in just a moment. The first argument of this function is a string. The string is the name of the event. The function can then be given a second argument, but you don't need to. The second argument can be any single piece of data. This data can then be used by subscribers to do things. If you want or need to pass multiple pieces of data to a subscriber, you can put them into a data structure, such as an array or a struct. Finally, any instance can subscribe to an event by putting pub/sub subscribe in their create event or elsewhere, but it's almost always going to be in the create event, and the function that they want to fire when that event happens. Now, this function can accept up to one argument. This argument would be the data that is passed in by the pub/sub publish function. Now, this is probably the most complicated part of simply using the system, as you have to understand how to write anonymous functions. But if you don't already know how to do that, there is a link in the top right. And that's it. To recap, you need this object and this set of scripts, and then you need one and only one instance of this object to exist. Then you publish events with pub/sub publish and subscribe to events with pub/sub subscribe. So let's go over two examples in a little bit more detail. First, we are using pub/sub publish when we collect a coin. Again, remember that when we collect a coin, the amount of coins collected goes up. This happens because when you pick up a coin, which happens on a collision with the player, the event coin collected is fired, which you can see here. We publish this event using this pub/sub publish function. We pass in the event name that we want as a string, in this case, coin collected, and we could pass in data, but again, we don't need to, and for this event, we won't. And over here, you can see an example of an object subscribing to this event with the function pub/sub subscribe. They pass in the name of the event they want to subscribe to as a string, coin collected. You can see that it is the same in both cases, and the function that they want to run when this event is fired. In this case, again, we're not passing along or using any data. We're just incrementing the number of global coins collected by 1. The next example we'll look at is the open chest event. You'll notice that when we open a chest, the other two chests blow up. This is because when you open the chest, that chest fires off an event. This time, we're not only publishing the event, which you can see here with pub/sub publish chest opened, but we're passing along some data, the ID of the instance that fired the event. And not only does a chest fire an event, but every chest actually subscribes to that event as well, which you can see over here. Again, pub/sub subscribe, chest opened. And here, the function that we are using actually takes a piece of data, that is the ID that is passed in over here with pub/sub publish. And then each chest is using that data and comparing it to their own ID to figure out if they were the ones that fired the event. If they were not the ones that fired the event, then they know that they are not the chest that is opened and they destroy themselves. There's actually one more pub/sub event in this project and a couple objects that subscribe to the events I just went over, but to keep the tutorial from going on too long, I won't cover them. Still, I hope that you will get this project and experiment a bit with it yourself. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them down below. And that's really it for using it. You make sure the pub/sub manager exists, and then you have objects publish and subscribe to events represented by strings where the publisher can, but doesn't need to, pass along some data, and the subscriber runs an anonymous function that can, but doesn't have to, use that data. One last note for using the system. It's a good practice to use either the unsub or unsub all function in the cleanup event of any instance that subscribes to something, which you can see an example of here. But this isn't strictly necessary in most cases, as the publish event does check for instance existence. Okay, so that's how to use it. But now let's go through how this system actually works. And again, this is going to be a little bit more complicated. But I think if you have mastered or at least are familiar with the basics of structs, arrays, functions, and binding, it shouldn't be too bad. Let's start with the script asset. Each of these functions follow a similar pattern. First, they use with to access the pub/sub manager, and assuming that is successful, use the pub/sub manager's internal method and return true. If no instance of the pub/sub manager exists, it returns false. You don't need to use these return values, but you can if you want to verify that the message is going through, or at least that the pub/sub manager actually does exist. So why do it this way? Well, a couple of reasons. First, with contains an inherent instance exists check, so your game won't crash if you don't have a pub/sub manager. This is also a convenient place to add some error checking and handling if you want. Currently, I'm just using true and false, but these could be more robust. Second, say you wanted to have multiple pub/sub managers. It would be very easy to make that change. Since with loops through all instances of an object, you simply need to add a variable to the pub/sub manager, pass that variable in as an argument, and check against that variable. For example, we could add the argument pub/sub manager name, and then we could check if this pub/sub manager's name equals that argument, and if it doesn't, continue. Again, I tend to only use one pub/sub manager, but it is easy to modify this particular system to use more than one if you want. Also note that we are passing in the instance IDs automatically. If you want to expand this system to work for structs as well, you would probably want to pass in the ID as an argument so that it could be either an instance ID or a struct reference. So that's it for the global functions. Now let's look at the PubSub manager itself. The PubSub manager only has a create event, and outside of its method variables and some enums, only has the variable event struct. And I've included a diagram of this struct up above. Diagrams like this, by the way, are really helpful for documenting how more complex data structures are laid out. And I use them even in my own personal projects. In this diagram, you can see that struct keys will be the event name, and the data attached to those keys will be an array of arrays. Each main array is an array of subscribers, and the internal arrays hold the instance ID of the subscriber and the subscriber's function. So if we look at the subscribe method, we can see that it takes 3 arguments. And note that the first argument is the ID that is being passed in automatically by the PubSub subscribe function. First, we check to see if the event already exists, and if not, we create it. Then we check to see if the instance is already subscribed, and if it isn't, we add its information, the array containing the ID and the function of this subscriber, into this subscription list. And I'll explain is subscribed in a moment. Next up, we have the publish function. The first thing we do is get the subscriber list for this event. Then we do a check to make sure it isn't undefined, which is what would happen if this event didn't exist. And then we loop through that subscriber list and run each subscriber's function. And there's a couple important things to talk about here. First, notice that we are looping backwards. This is for a very specific reason. As we loop through our subscriber list, we are checking to see if the subscriber still exists. If it doesn't, we are deleting it. If we were looping forwards, this would cause us to skip a subscriber. So instead, we loop backwards. The next important thing to remember is that we can directly call a function because method variables are bound to the scope that they were created in. Since we are creating the functions as an anonymous function inside of an instance, it will be bound to that instance. We can then run that function from anywhere, and it will still operate on the instance it is bound to. Finally, note that we are passing in the data as an argument here. If this argument was not given, then it will simply be undefined, and that is fine in GML. I am going to run through this briefly in the debugger, but I want to quickly go over the remaining functions. IsSubscribe is a basic for loop that loops through the entire subscriber list and checks whether or not a specific ID is in that list. It's used in 2 different places, which is why it gets its own function. We've already seen it being used in the subscribe method, but it's also used in the unsubscribe method. The unsubscribe method looks through a specific event for that instance ID, and if it finds it, deletes it from that event list. Unsubscribe all does the exact same thing, except instead of checking a specific event, it loops through all of them, calling unsubscribe on each event. This, by the way, is how you loop through a struct. Finally, we have remove event, which simply checks to see whether an event exists, and if so, removes it. Remove all events, which resets the entire event struct. And remove dead instances, which proactively loops through the entire event struct and checks each instance to see if it still exists and removes it if it does not. If you have to use this, something has probably gone wrong, but it can be useful as a failsafe if you find that subscribers aren't being removed after they are destroyed for some reason. Although again, you should be controlling this by using unsubscribe in the cleanup event. So let's run this in the debugger. I'm going to put a couple breakpoints in and then run it. Okay, so I've put 2 breakpoints in. The first breakpoint is when our chest object subscribes to an event, and the second is when it publishes an event. And we're going to walk through those 2 sections of code to see exactly how this system is working. So I've run the debugger and we've stopped on that first event. We are now in the create event of the chest object. We see PubSub subscribed, chest opened, and the anonymous function that we're passing in. We can step into this. We can see that we are now inside the script function. We can do with PubSub manager. We can go into the PubSub manager's internal subscribe function or method. We can check to see whether or not this event struct exists. And in fact, rather than doing this here, let's look at our debugger. Let's look at the event struct. We can see 2 events already, player died, coin collected, but not chest opened. So this will be undefined and we will add it to the struct. Now you can see that it has been added to that struct. And now we can push our data, the ID of this object and this object's function, into this array. We can return true. This chest has been added. Let's just go through the rest of the chests. This one got added. This one got added. And now we can see that our game is actually running. So let's take a moment and look at our PubSub manager. We can come down here to the event struct. We can see our 3 events: coin collected, player died, chest opened. Here we have chest opened and we have 4 subscribers, because not only do we actually have the 3 chests, we have a metadata manager, which I haven't gone over in this tutorial, that is also hooked up to the PubSub system. You can see some global variables over here that are being tracked as well. Again, I would encourage you to download the project and look through this code yourself. But now let's actually publish an event. We can come over here, we can open a chest, and we have paused on that breakpoint. Let's go in. We have reached PubSub publish. Again, we are using the event name and we are passing in some data. So we go in, we are now inside the script function. We can go inside the internal PubSub manager method publish. Again, passing that data in, event and data. The first thing we can do is get the subscriber array. It does exist. You can see this array is the exact same as this array. And then we can loop through that array and run each subscriber's method. Now, the first subscriber is actually not a chest. It is our metadata manager, and it just tracks this global variable. But our next subscriber will be a chest, and we can see that it's running this anonymous function that we passed in, checking its ID against the ID, the data that we passed in. We can come down here and see that the data we passed in was 012, and this instance of the chest is 013. So it will get destroyed. And there we go, it's getting destroyed, it's creating the explosion. And you can come back. We can now go through to the next chest, again running its method. Here we have 012 and 012. So this is the chest that fired the event. It will not destroy itself. And then we have the final chest. We can come inside, 011, 012. It will destroy itself. And we can now run it and the remaining 2 chests blow up. And there we go. Let me know down below if you have any questions or if I made any mistakes or you have a suggestion for an improvement. And that's it. Thanks for watching.